So, this talk is Euclid, Socrates and Mel, Quality and Documentation. Also known as Matt, believe it or not, does not take hallucinogenic drugs, but I do occasionally read things like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which arguably is worse. Anyway, so you talk about quality and documentation, you get into the question of what is quality. I mean, we often say quality is, well, I know it when I see it, which is all very well as a statement, but doesn't actually give us much information. So one can say that quality is in our perception, except people will often agree amongst themselves that a particular thing has quality. So, I mean, the question, you know, is it in us, or is it in the thing that we're observing, that we're saying is a thing of quality? So, approximately the conclusion that the book comes to is that quality is not just in the observer or the thing that one observes, but in the process of observation. Quality is in our experience of the thing being of quality, which still doesn't help. No, really, it is too hard. I've tried to explain this coherently so many times now. And you end up going, I don't understand. What? So, in order to try and get a handle on this, it's necessary to take a starting point. So, what's the aim of documentation? The real aim of documentation is to make somebody feel like Keanu Reeves in The Matrix. It is to make them have that moment where they go, whoa, I know Kung Fu. That's what documentation is for. You do that, your user is addicted. They're gonna learn everything at that point. But how do we get them there? So, I mean, there's lots of different styles of documentation we can use. Which means that there's lots of different styles of quality of documentation, which of course makes the question even harder. So I'm going to talk in terms of three great philosophers. So first, Euclid. I'm not sure there's anywhere flat I can move things here. No, there is a ledge under here, it's all good. Right, so, Euclid. Euclid wrote a book called The Elements. He was a Greek philosopher and mathematician. Euclid's Elements pretty much defined the basis of modern geometry. To the point where the truly crazy stuff, where parallel lines aren't parallel. Well, they are, but any mathematicians in the audience, please excuse me for lying here, but it's close enough. Is known as non-Euclidean geometry. So The Elements was an amazing piece of work. But because of the Greek tradition, it was purely synthetic. It was all, here is one fact, then using this we can derive this fact, then using this we can derive this fact, and so on. Started off from a very small number of postulates, which were things that had to be taken as assumptions. The fifth of which, the parallel postulate, people then spent about a millennium and a half trying to turn into a proof, and eventually somebody proved it couldn't be done. And that Euclid was right and basically been laughing at the entirety of mathematicians for 1600 years or so. I like Euclid. And it then all proofs derived therefrom. So you never had forward references. Anything that was required in order to prove the thing at hand had already been proven in a previous part of the book. So it was the sort of principle of, you know, you have a subroutine in a piece of source code, and you always make sure that the routines that it's called are declared before that, in order to make it easier to read. So you end up building up information very sort of linearly and in a way where people can't really say, but you never have to say trust me. And that allows you to build up a very coherent model and a very consistent set of understanding. I think the best example of a Euclidean work is probably Kernigan and Rich's The C programming language. Now, I hope everybody here, or at least everybody here who's a programmer, has read K&R. If you haven't, really, I don't care if you're never going to write C. Get a copy and read it for the simple reason of it is such a beautiful book. And that's pretty much the ideal. Other than the first chapter where they sort of flap about a bit. K&R is a purely Euclidean book. And the advantages of this approach are you have very clear initial requirements on the student because you have explicitly stated assumptions. You're providing very much sort of solid foundations for learning because you're always stepping along and not bouncing back and forth. It is very much, the Euclidean style is the style where you always know where your tail is. And evidently it's too early in the morning for Douglas Adam jokes, moving on. But it very much gives people a consistent mental model of what's going on. It does have a problem though, because it's a very dry style. It also tends to end up quite terse, so you don't have huge amounts of explanation. Man pages are very much in the Euclidean style, and we all know how much newbies love man pages. And because it's the organisation is very much based on making sure that you introduce facts in the order of proof, you don't tend to be able to touch very much on why, because the order of purpose tends to be a completely different order. Aristotle. Aristotle was interesting. He was a great mathematician who clearly didn't do purely synthetic proofs. In fact, Aristotle published some fantastic stuff where it was really obvious that what he'd done was done an analytical proof to actually satisfy himself that this was true. But then, because he couldn't publish that, had then gone back and created a fake synthetic proof for the result just so he could publish it as part of the Greek tradition. So he did these amazing things where he'd have this hugely complicated geometric shape, and then in order to prove some property of it, he'd draw a line across the middle and prove that you could balance the thing so that it had equal amounts on either side. And in that way was able to create synthetic proofs for what were very much analytical results. But it was very much contrived synthesis, and it showed that this was a limitation of the synthetic approach. So the alternative way forwards is an analytical approach, which brings us roughly onto Socrates. So Socrates' principle was people already know the truth, people already have some comprehension of this is it, but we don't understand why we know that's true. So the Socratic method is significantly about taking things that we consider to be obvious and then working back by a process of analysis until we understand why it's true, rather than merely intuitively knowing that it is. The Socratic approach tends to be highly discursive. It is, shockingly enough, for a man who's fated as one of the great philosophers of all time, it's a somewhat philosophical approach. Yes. And the Socratic approach is very much about inferring your own conceptual model for the material under study. So whereas the Euclidean approach presents things in order such that quality may be observed, the Socratic approach is very much about going seeking after quality. And not just a quality of knowledge, but a quality of understanding. And also an idea of why this piece of knowledge is important. The purpose of learning and the purpose of understanding this, which is a very important thing when you're trying to teach design or whatever. So the idea of the sort of Socrates approach is you bring people to the truth, and not just that, but you bring them to some abstract concept of the good. It's not just this is the thing that you wanted to learn that will solve your problem. It's to learn in order to be able to create a good solution to the problem. A Euclidean method will teach you type clocks. A Socratic method will start by teaching you moves. The Socratic approach, an interesting example. I was looking at Java example from a friend of mine's course notes, and they demonstrated here are two method names. In order to go, here is an accessor method and here is a calculation method. No! That's completely wrong! You don't expose the implementation of the method. Not exposing implementation is a key part of our work. This exposes the implementation of the name! Stupid! This is what you want. Because the consumer of an object should not have to care which of these is a property and which of these is calculated. So if you start off from the wrong example and go, this exposes the implementation, can you see how it exposes the implementation? Can you see why exposing the implementation is bad? And a Socratic approach allows you to create understanding there. Whereas with the Euclidean approach, all you do is you say, names that expose the nature of the implementation are bad. Here is an example of a name that does not expose the nature of the implementation. At which point the person you're trying to teach to goes, but why? Which is why you need the Socratic method for teaching niceties of design. And also, you can discuss why not. You can point out, well, what happens if age becomes a property and now year of birth is being calculated off the object. Well, now your method names make sense. You can go from there to get people to understand that. So the Socratic method, very strong on teaching principles, and very strong on teaching the sort of fuzzier stuff. Morality and purpose and conceptual reasoning. And it's also very good for connecting conceptual stuff into the real world so that people can see how they need to relate those back. Most interesting, because the Socratic method focuses on why, it doesn't just connect to why would you do this, it connects to why would doing this make you happy. Obviously in the case of Perl, the reason doing anything makes us happy is because now we've committed code we like and we can go to the pub. So the whole sort of the Socrates style approach allows us to get across beauty in a way that the more technical, drier approaches don't. But of course it does have disadvantages. It's highly subjective because it's a means for putting across philosophical principles and so on. And there's an implicit assumption that the person has a baseline understanding. It doesn't help to say, here's a treatise on method naming if they don't know enough about to know what a method is yet. And the one thing that I have encountered as a problem is, this assumes that people want to write beautiful code. And at 4 PM on a Friday when you're trying to get something launched so you can go home, that person at that moment does not want to write beautiful code. They just want it to work, right? So there's only certain times where this approach will actually apply. And the other thing is, it is very much anti-immediately getting things done. Because the Socratic approach is all about stop and think about it, and see your reasoning. Which is very Zen, but doesn't really work for the I just want to hack this out approach. So, one of the things that originally got me thinking about this years ago is the Catalyst tutorial. Yes. So the old tutorial was basically, here's a couple of controllers. Uses XML RPC so we can bypass all of that messy view stuff and we'll just demonstrate Catalyst. And it really did just show the controller and the dispatch system. And people went, oh, I don't like this tutorial, it isn't real, why can't you have something that demonstrates a proper application? So can it be class? Matt wrote a new tutorial. And the new tutorial is a complete application. ORM, templates, controller, authorization, you know, it is a simple, but nonetheless, a real application. And people go, but there's too much at once, I can't, why isn't there something that just shows the controller? It's like, we had that, we had that in 2004 when you all hated it. Documentation is hard, right? Even stepping back and watching other people write documentation, which is my specialty, is hard. So you just, what? The answer is, if your documentation serves one set of users, the other groups of users are going to turn up and complain. That doesn't mean that your documentation is wrong. What it means is you don't have documentation that is right for the person complaining. So I would recommend, instead of replacing it, augment it until you have 2 or 3 sets of documentation, and then everybody will complain about all of them, because that's how every user is, right? But at least they will learn. The purpose of the documentation will be served. Mill. John Stuart Mill, fantastic guy. Not only was he one of the greatest writers about utilitarianism, which is a fascinatingly mathematical philosophy, but then, because he was actually raised in the principle of utilitarianism by his father, and then because utilitarianism is strong on mathematical and short on human, he had a nervous breakdown, was crazy for several years, and then wrote a book called On Liberty. So I'm going to use John Stuart Mill as my example for my 2 remaining philosophies, because they're completely opposite, because he went a little bit mad briefly and changed his mind. Anyway, so utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a moral philosophy based on the concept of utility. Basically, the idea is to maximize happiness overall. It's a very cold and calculated thing, because it is really, you try and assign numbers to the happiness and then add the numbers up. And whatever result produces the highest number, that's the good thing to do. So in utilitarianism, the end always justifies the means. If 15 people will be slightly happier by the fact that a puppy is no longer barking every night, then utilitarianism entirely says that if that level of happiness is greater, that completely outweighs the unhappiness of the man who discovers his puppy cut to pieces on his doorstep in the morning. Like I say, strong on mathematical, short on human. So the principle is all about that. So it's very much goal-oriented. So I would say utilitarian documentation is snippets, cookbook recipes. So very much sort of very basic things, and you only generally have just enough context to provide an understanding. So I mean the Perl Cookbook, most wikis everywhere, except for the Perl Foundation wiki, which just I don't know, it's like a useful wiki and then somebody set it on fire. Anyway. Yes, if any of you want practice on improving documentation, go to the Perl Foundation wiki, pick a page at random, click edit, and then put your cat on the keyboard. It's going to improve it. Anyway, utilitarian style, it can be illustrative. It can be informative. But the important thing is that it's actionable. The important thing is, you take this, you copy and paste it into the module or a terminal or whatever, and you fiddle about with it, and in 10 minutes it runs and it does what you want. That's the utilitarian principle. It's all about things that people can try, tweak, and above all, use. They don't even necessarily have to understand it, so long as it does what they want. They'll go back and understand it later when they need to make it do something more complicated. So cookbooks are very much in this drill. How-tos are very much in this spirit. So the advantages of utilitarianism. Very minimal requirements, because you don't even necessarily need to understand the code afterwards. Rapid wow moments, getting somebody from 0 to, oh, this is cool. Oh, occasionally somebody turns up on free-note hash Perl and goes, I'm having trouble doing this with a regular expression. What you really want to do is point them at the relevant dots. And then you're thinking, this guy's blatantly a sysadmin. If this is hard, he's just going to hack it up with shell and he's never going to come back. So, okay, look, here's your regular expression. And they stick it in the terminal and run it and go, oh, whoa, this is cool. And the next day they're back and you teach them 6 modules. And this is where it's awesome fun. The point is, utilitarian stuff needs to give the user a sense of accomplishment quickly. They need to feel like they've achieved something. They need to feel like they've got stuff done. Because if you do that, they'll come back and learn it in depth later on. So the disadvantages. Well, okay, you fail at that because this is all just actionable recipes. So you're not really giving people a clear model, which is why eventually you need to lure them into the Socratic style. And the other thing is, the one problem you do have with like snippet style stuff is the sort of what do I do next? I've got this to work, and then, so you need more of a tutorial style to get people through that. And the other problem is this style massively results in cargo culting because it is specifically, here is a piece of code to cargo cult. Please go and cargo cult. Which, if you're trying to avoid people doing that, isn't so good. Obviously, if you want them to automate their cargo culting and have code do the cargo culting for them, introduce them to this syllable. That's a different story. The point is, you need to support this style. So, learning Perl, programming Perl, and the Perl Cookbook. They were my Bible when I originally learned. I think I've got about 6 minutes left. If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. Sorry? 8? Right, excellent. Anyway, so when I first learned Perl, this was my Bible in 3 parts. And learning Perl is very much sort of your Euclidean text. Programming Perl is your Socratic text, and the Perl Cookbook is the utilitarian text. But there's a part missing. This is where libertarianism comes in. On Liberty defines a moral philosophy called libertarianism. This is nothing to do with the bad Americans, okay? This is a genuine school of philosophy, not a school of shoot people and try and bring down the government. That's not libertarianism, that's Texas. The concept of liberty. It's all about freedom. The basic principle of libertarianism is you should be allowed to do whatever makes you happy as long as it doesn't impact anybody else's happiness. It's a lot like utilitarianism, except the puppy gets to live. It's about freedom and it's about happiness, and it's very much about do whatever. Which I think is, this is something we miss in documentation because we're trying to say, this is what you should do, this is how this should work. And I think, I'm not sure that that's really necessarily in the Perl tradition. I mean, a few years back, Larry's keynote started with him going, programming is hard, let's go scripting. And there's a point in that. Which is, yes, we want to convince people to do things the right way. But it's more important that we convince people to do things at all and end up with something that works, that they're happy with. Code that does what it's supposed to do, that the author is happy with. I'm not seeing a problem with that. Even if it makes me want to die inside. Or, given some of my, I code recently that I think makes at least one member of my audience want to die inside. But it works, anyway. So how do you apply this? Well, give people a principle, the concept of how this code works, and give them starting points. And then give them the freedom to go whatever direction they want. Here are some bits and pieces. Take these concepts, interlock them together, go wherever you like. If it works for you, if it makes you happy, just enjoy. And also, focusing on that sort of idea gives people the chance to go as fast or as slow as they want. So a full-time programmer can try and learn everything today. And as this happening, can come back for half an hour at a time when he's between backup jobs over the course of 3 months and learn. And by letting people make their own decisions on how they learn, you're going to end up with them having a much better an understanding of your code that's much more suited to their idea of what they want to do with it. So we go back to the idea of you need the tutorial. You need the reference and you need the cookbook, but you also need something like a Principia, something that says, here is the philosophical concepts, here is what it means to use this code, and what it meant to me to write this code, and therefore here is how you need to think about it. And I think if you can provide an effective Principia, then people are going to have a lot less aha moments. Git needs a Principia. If somebody could have explained, forget everything you know about version control. Here is the Git world. In Git world, a commit means this, a branch means this, a patch means this. It is nothing to do with anything you ever learned before. But once you understand it, it will make perfect sense. And you will be completely unable to explain it to anybody else. Drives me insane. You get the same problem with DBIX class and result sets, or Catalyst and change URLs. They're both things where once you know how to use them, you don't know how you could ever have done without them. But you're trying to explain them to somebody? Oh yes, very funny. And I think the Principia concept significantly will get around that. So, I mean, basically, this is necessary but not sufficient to provide useful documentation. You still need to give people multiple ways in. Most importantly, you need to remember that the process of learning is meant to be fun. So give people ways to play with your project, to experiment and see where they get, because that means they're going to have fun. If they have fun, they're going to keep using it. And you always want your user to go, what? You don't want the user to end up going, this is a cool piece of software. You want the user to go, wow, I'm cool. Because that's the most important thing ever. And it is fundamentally the thing that keeps us coming back to programming, in spite of all the hate, pain, agony, and occasionally even PHP. You've got to give your users that I know kung fu moment if they're really going to come with you. The thing to remember is, kung fu actually comes from gung fu, which basically means hard work. Now, that's what it originally meant. The idea was a great master had spent 15 years doing the hard work to develop his fighting discipline. And that's something we should never forget. Because our hard work as maintainers and documenters enables the user's hard work trying to learn things to give them that advantage and to make them happy. So one should remember, documentation is not there because you need to have documentation. Documentation is there because you want to teach people how to use your code. And you can do that on IRC, you can do that on mailing lists, but the most effective way to teach the largest number of people is to write a manual for them to read. So when you're writing documentation, fundamentally what you are doing is teaching by broadcast. Always think about it that way, and you're going to give your users the right principle, because this is just one of your mechanisms of teaching. Treat it as that, and as fitting in with all of the rest of it. Play the approaches, see where you go. Hopefully better documentation than I write, which isn't difficult. Thank you very much. So I think technically we're about on the point where the break should start. Does anybody want to ask me anything other than what the hell was that and why did I just sit through it?
Does Shadow actually have Catalan content?
Yes. Since the .cat domain is for promotion of the Catalan language and culture, we sponsored barcelona.pm to convert two of Rendell Schwartz's Linux Journal articles on Moose and Moose Manual Intro into Catalan and publish those on there. Yep.
When you can replace the old documentation, keep it, and have it used up as well, one of the problems is that documentation gets stale and it's no longer correct. How do you cope with that? Because you lose the old wrong way.
That's a problem even when the thing is, that's a problem even when you've only got one set of documentation.
Yeah.
The best thing I found for this is, in terms of making sure the documentation doesn't atrophy so it's not useful, tutorials, you should always have a running version of the code for the tutorial, and make sure that's good enough test to check that it works, and then basically you run the tests to make sure that piece of documentation still works. There's things like test inline that make that easier. And then in terms of keeping it conceptually up to date, realistically you just have to rely on people going through it every so often and checking. But if you, the important thing is to get basically the sort of serious hackers of a project trained, so when they completely reinvent something, they go to the documentation team and go, hi, I just made a much better way to do this. We'll need to update the tutorial. And basically, if they reinvent the world and don't tell the documentation people that the world is now reinvented and the docs need to be changed, then you need your documenters to chase them down and shout at them. On the projects I'm involved with, what happens is Castaway comes and looks unhappy at me, and I feel incredibly guilty, and then it gets sorted out. But it really is, it is a human problem. You just have to organise it. And it's kind of a necessity to do this. And you want to be reviewing the documentation regularly anyway. If you create a culture where newbies understand that their feedback on the documentation is welcome, often they'll spot these problems for you. So, yes, it's a boring task, but it tends not to be a big deal.
Thank you very much.
So,